Well, thank you for coming out tonight. So, how to build your own 10-inch Chiefspeigler planet-killing telescope, also known as I built my last telescope. And this is indeed a fact. I haven't built a telescope since 2015. This is actually when I gave this talk originally. It was back in 2015. We were sharing library space for our Recreational Astronomy Nights. And they were closing at 8 o'clock, so we had to get out of there fast, and there was a Jays game going on that night, so attendance was really low. So I thought maybe it might be relevant and still of interest for me to repeat this talk. And so here I am. So I'm primarily a planetary imager, and we all like big, large aperture, large diameter telescopes, because the bigger a scope, the more detail you can resolve. So in a perfect world, I think everybody would have a big refractor. But unfortunately, a big refractor costs big money and also weighs big time. So really the most popular big telescopes tend to be things like the Celestron 14-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain, like we have. I think we still have it at the CAO. I'm not sure if we do anymore. It's a nice scope, large aperture, fairly affordable and compact and fairly light. But all these popular large aperture telescopes have what's called a central obstruction. That's the secondary mirror. And that has an effect on the performance of a scope. So when you have a refractor where you have no obstruction, all the energy goes right into the center. But when you have a secondary mirror, like here, and most mirrors are expressed as a percentage of its diameter versus the diameter of the scope itself. So these secondary mirrors tend to be about 35% in size of obstruction. Some of the energy is diverted to the first diffraction ring, and this causes a decrease in sharpness and contrast. Now, this is not a really good example because you really can't see the difference between the two, but the picture on the right is slightly less sharp and slightly less contrasty. So to mitigate this design compromise, people thought, why don't we just tilt the mirror of the reflector so that we don't have to use a diagonal like this? And one of the most famous examples of this, and one of the first examples, was by British and German astronomer Sir William Herschel. So Sir William was not particularly concerned about central obstruction problems. His mirrors back there are made out of this alloy called speculum, which is an alloy of copper and tin. And he had to constantly polish it because I guess it would oxidize quite quickly. But his reflectivity was really low, only 60%. So if he added a second mirror, the diagonal, or the secondary mirror, I should say, then he would be reducing the transmission of light so much that his images would be too dim to observe. So what he did was he tilted the primary mirror, and he stood off to one side, and he held up his eyepiece, and he did his observing that way. And here you see him standing in front of his famous 40-foot telescope. 40 foot refers to the length of the scope itself. It's actually a 4-foot diameter f10 reflector. Now, I think it was commissioned by King George III in 1689 for 4,000 pounds. But the problem is when you tilt the mirror, you introduce aberrations like coma. So he couldn't really see very clearly out of that scope. So he reverted to his original scope, which is the 20-footer. It's a bit slower. It's an f13 18-inch reflector. And this one, he could boost the magnification up to about 160 times. So he actually got more useful work out of his old scope than with the new one. So this idea, these are the aberrations that you encounter when you tilt your primary mirror out of the way. You get coma, which is like a fantail on the end of your object, or astigmatism, which completely distorts the object itself. So this idea gained popularity. This is German film director Anton Kuder. And he devised something which he called a Chiefspiegler, which is German for oblique refractor. He used a concave primary mirror and a convex secondary. to get a zero obstruction scope. But again, lots of coma with this design, so he had to use a very slow scope at f/25. He added a third mirror in 1975, I should say, and that helped to reduce the optical aberrations. And then finally, he added a plano-convex lens midway between the secondary and the focal point, and he called this the Catadioptric Schiefspiegler. And he got very nice images, very apochromatic, sharp images. But the problem is these scopes are very expensive to make because all the lenses had to be custom ground to specific prescription. So not easy to make at all, at least not for an amateur. Luckily, in 2008, retired optician Ed Jones introduced his version of a tilted telescope, the Catadioptric Herschelian Schiefspiegler or Chiefspiegler. And the advantage of this is that all these components can be bought off the shelf. The primary tends to be either an 8 or 10 inch parabolic mirror, f10 or slower, the slower the better, and a pair of 2-inch plano-convex and plano-concave lenses of opposite and equal focal lengths. And by tilting them a certain degree and at a certain distance away from the focal point, you get correction of all the aberrations, and you get a nice sharp image with zero obstruction. Oh, there we go. Oops. I'll go back one more. So I thought I'd play around with, I was just learning how to use SketchUp at the time. So I thought I'd design this scope with SketchUp and see if I could figure out any problems with it before I actually built it. So this is just a little movie. Can you actually run the movie for me? Or okay. I have to move the mouse? Okay.
Right to the right.
Okay.
All the way to the right. Right to the,
Okay.
down,
Mm-hmm.
down, down, down.
Down, all the way down?
There you go.
Okay. Ah, got it. Okay, thank you. So I thought I'd build a naked kind of a truss-like scope that aids in the scope attaining thermal equilibrium quickly, and it's also a little easier to manufacture, I think. And also a little different too. And you notice too that this scope has an optical flat. That's the little blue mirror at the top to reduce the length of the scope and make it a little easier to observe. Otherwise, you'd have a very long scope at f10, and then you'd have to be up on a ladder viewing through the very end of the scope. Okay. So, this is made out of 1-inch diameter aluminum round and square tube. There's a Losmandy dovetail plate. And there's the 10-inch f10, oh, it's actually f8 mirror here. We've got an optical flat. And these are the plano-convex and plano-concave lenses that you can actually buy off the shelf from those companies. The focal length is not particularly important as long as they're equal and opposite. And they do have to be made of the same glass. So here I am, I'm cutting those cross braces. I don't have a machine tool shop, so when I cut one, I have to use that as a template for the other ones to make sure they all turn out exactly the same. So there they are, all cut up. This is a base Baltic birch with some holes for ventilation. That's like an 80s vintage Novak 10-inch mirror cell. And that's mounted on some spring-mounted bolts for collimation. One of the cross braces, I think it's probably these two over here, don't come at 90 degrees, so they need a bit of a custom angle so I made a little jig so that the holes would be drilled correctly. And you can determine these angles by using these digital angle gauges, which are very handy. Yeah, we need this too also because we have to control the tilt of the primary. The primary should only be tilted about 3 degrees off the vertical. If you tilt it too much, you introduce, again, too many aberrations. So that is kind of the skeleton. That's the upper assembly, close up. And I didn't really need to weld this or glue it down. It's all sort of fit together by friction. Although I think in the end I probably ran some screws through them just to make sure they were secure. This is determining the focal length of a mirror. It's a lot of fun. You wait for a nice sunny day at the right time of day, and you aim it at a piece of wood and you make it burn. And then I confirm that this indeed is an f7.9. It's really quite accurate. And that's the optical flat mirror cell, probably plumbing supplies, and then just again mounted on some spring-loaded bolts. This is the mounter for the focuser. I made a bit of a boo-boo here. I made these two too wide, so the focuser didn't really sit on the metal. They sit sort of in between, and so the screw holes would not go through the meat of the metal, but through the side. So I ended up putting some cross braces and just rotating the focuser slightly so that all the holes would line up against metal. Yeah, this is just boring. How to make a cross brace? So you drill a hole, cut in the middle, and then it's like those Lincoln logs you used to make log cabins when you were a kid. And so I just rotated the focuser mount slightly so that all the holes met up with an actual piece of metal. And the most important thing are these Allen screws. This is what controls the actual tilt of the focuser, so they can get the focuser exactly orthogonal to the secondary mirror. And I was just playing around here. Usually you can't weld aluminum because the melting temperature is beyond propane torch, but you can buy these sticks of aluminum that have a much lower melting temperature, and you can actually use them and almost like solder and do aluminum welding that way. So I was just experimenting to see what it was like. But as it turns out, you didn't really have to weld this at all. They fit together quite nicely. So this is the very critical corrective lens assembly. As you can see, there is adjustments galore because there's a lot of fiddling around that you have to do. And by designing all these adjustments in, that allows you to position these lenses at their optimal locations for the best optical effect. So this allows the whole assembly to slide back and forth relative to the focuser. That's the plano-concave lens. That's the plano-convex lens. As you can see, they're mounted so that you can actually slide them in and out so that you can actually have the beam of light go through not the center of the lens, but off-center, which is actually the way the design is meant to be for optimal effect. And you can adjust the separation angle between them, although that usually is fixed at an optimal angle. And you can also adjust the angle of the whole thing with this thing right here. It's a big bolt with a compression spring, so I can wind it up and cause this whole structure to swing this way. Yeah, so here's a close-up of one of the lenses. So you can see that I can actually turn the screw and cause the lens to move laterally and have the light path actually go off-center. So I just discovered this. You can buy these tension springs everywhere, but you can't buy compression springs. But you can make your own because all you have to do is just deform them. Just stretch them until they're permanently deformed, and then you have an instant compression spring. So, yeah. Normally, when you collimate a reflector, you put a little center spot on your mirror because that center spot is occluded by the secondary, so it's not going to be in the way. But you can't spot these mirrors because the whole mirror surface is being used for light transmission. So I just made up some circles with Photoshop that were the right size, and to aid in the collimation. So I would actually cut the circle out and put it on the mirror so I know exactly where the center of the mirror should be. And you'll see these guys in action in just a few more slides. So some of you might be wondering, how do I know exactly where to place these things? Because it's almost like guesswork, but no, it's not. There's a specific plan, and there's computer software. For example, Oslo is one of them, where if you plug in all the parameters, in this case, they're starting with an 8-inch primary mirror, and they've got the focal length there, the thickness of it. They even have there's diameter. And so you've got your three axes. The XY axis would be the plane that all the optical components live in, and the Z axis would be the plane where the incident light goes through. So here it is. We've got the primary mirror tilted 3 degrees off the vertical. And then we've got the first plano-concave lens there. That's its focal length. And that's the tilt that it requires. And this is the plano-convex lens. And that's the tilt required. So the tilt between the two of them is about 15.4 degrees, as you can see if you read them off. And so this software tells you exactly where to place all your components to get the best optical image quality. So here I am. I'm collimating the focuser itself to the optical flat. So you can see I've taped that little Photoshop paper circle over the flat, and so I know exactly where the center is. So I can adjust these Allen screws until the laser hits the center of the optical flat. And then I collimate the optical flat to the primary. And again, here it is. You see the laser beam bounces off the optical flat, and then you adjust the optical flat until the beam bounces off the center here. And then you have to, of course, collimate the primary. And as it turns out, the Home Depot bucket is a perfect fit for the mirror cell. So I just cut a hole in there so the laser will pass through, and the center of the bucket is actually the center of the mirror. And so you want it to pass through the center. And so it's slightly off, and then now it's on. And this is me trying to determine exactly where the optical flat should go, because obviously if it is in the wrong position, it might not be seeing all the light, and if it's or if it's too close, then it's being wasted. And so that's the circle of light produced by the primer on a sunny day. But I also noticed that another problem, this brace is in the way. It's cutting off part of the valuable light from the primer here. So I ended up having to redo that part and cutting out a hunk. Yeah, not the way it's supposed to go, but it worked. So you can see that actually worked out quite well. This circle is the optical flat, and the red circle is the primary. And so the primary is maybe touching a little bit on the frame still, but it's okay. But it's still well within the confines of the optical flat. And this is something that also is critical. You have to adjust what's called the back focal length, where the focal point, the distance between the focal point and the back of the last lens in that pair. So you just tape a piece of cellophane, and then you focus. That's the moon that's actually showing up there. So you focus until you get a sharp image. Then you measure from that piece of tape to the last lens, and just make sure that it's in that close to that critical value that's supposed to be. And if it's not, you can move the lens assembly back and forth. So the structure really is not as rigid as it should be, because once I mounted on an equatorial mount, there's a bit of sagging, and so you can see the collimation that was okay standing up is off when it's mounted. So I had to re-collimate the mirror. There you go. And this is to show that the beam is actually passing straight vertical. So I had made up a jig where the light should be coming through, and the return beam from the primary should be, and that's where it is. And so you can see this is. I'm not sure if this is without I'm not sure where I got this picture from. This might have been before I was fiddling with it, but I was happy after I fiddled with the tilt and everything that I got a better picture. So this is Crater Copernicus. You can see that this is a lot better than this. But the interesting picture is this is what you get when you tilt the primary only and you have no corrective lenses in the optical train. And then when you put the optical train back in, that's that little triangular piece of hinged metal with the two lenses. The great improvement that you see. So this is what Herschel would probably see. I mean, it's terrible, really, in terms of what he could observe, you know. And there it is in action. I like to show this telescope because it doesn't look like a telescope. Most people do not equate this as what a telescope should classically look like. And finally, I found this guy a few weekends ago, and he told me that summer is finally here. Thank you. Yeah, any questions? Yes. Oh.
The question was, how long did
to take you to do this?
You know, I can't remember. It was a phase of my life where I was feverishly making telescopes after telescopes. Probably design took a lot longer than building. Building maybe took a couple of weeks, but the design part was, thinking and collecting the materials probably took months. Yeah. At the very back. Oh, sorry.
We have a question from online. How do you mount a camera onto the telescope?
Yeah, you would just use one of those small planetary cameras and you just mount it in place of the eyepiece. Yeah, so you could mount anything heavy like a DSLR, but you could mount those tiny cameras that you use for planetary imaging.
How much money did the corrective lenses and the optical flat cost?
Good question.
There's thousands.
Good question. I think it was probably under $1,000, I think, for the build. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it does shake a bit. You're right. So you have to be careful in what conditions they're using it in. So if I were to redesign it, I probably would redesign it with more bracing and but it does work. Yeah. Yes.
Once it's all set up and collimated, does it take a lot of tweaking once you move it out into the field and point it at different parts of the sky?
Yeah, I haven't really used it that much since it was made, so I cannot give you a good answer. I suspect that because it's not as rigid as it should be, that it probably does require a bit of tweaking after you transport it, and stuff like that. But once it's set up at your site, it should be pretty stable. Yeah. Yes.
You wrote a book of projects.
Yes,
Is this in there?
no, I'm hoping for a second edition. So no, that's just hopeful wishful thinking. No, it didn't make it. It's too bad because I would have loved to have included that in there. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Good night.